Hello, this is Digestive System video number 5. In this video, we're going to be talking about the stomach, anatomy and physiology of the stomach. So let's start with the gross anatomy. The stomach can be subdivided into different regions, and they're called the cardiac, fundus, body, and pylorus. They're illustrated on this slide. Here's the esophagus coming into the stomach. The gastroesophageal sphincter, the region right at the point where the esophagus joins with the stomach is the cardia region. That's close to the heart, and that's the reason for the name. The stomach forms a dome shape, and that's butting up against the bottom of the diaphragm, and that domed part, which is basically superior to the point where the esophagus comes in, is called the fundus. Dome-shaped part is the fundus. The largest part that runs from the gastroesophageal sphincter down through the main part of the stomach is called the body. That's the body of the stomach. And then the body begins to narrow, and this is where it's going to join into the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. And this narrowed part here is called the pylorus. So the stomach is bound by two sphincters, gastroesophageal sphincter here, and the pyloric sphincter, which is joining the pylorus of the stomach to the duodenum of the small intestine. The stomach has sort of a comma shape to it. So one side is a longer surface area, and that's called the greater curvature on that side. And the other side is, slightly concave, and that's called the lesser curvature on that side. All right, so greater curvature would be the lateral surface. Lesser curvature would be the medial surface. And this diagram, part of the wall of the stomach has been removed. And this would be what you would see in an empty stomach. The inner mucosal membrane forms these inner folds. Those are called the gastric rugae. And so those are the main areas of the stomach in terms of the gross anatomy. So now we're looking at, this diagram just shows the stomach with respect to the diaphragm and how the esophagus runs through the esophageal hiatus and joins with the stomach at the esophageal sphincter, gastroesophageal sphincter. And here it's showing that the fundus is bumping up against the bottom of the diaphragm. All right, and these are the sphincters controlling entry and exit from the stomach. And so the gastroesophageal controls entry, pyloric sphincter controls exit. What are the main functions of the stomach? They're listed here. 3 main functions. One is it's a temporary storage place for food. So the stomach is very expandable, and it can hold up to a gallon of food. And this is approaching, a 2-liter bottle, if you think about it, a 2-liter bottle. You probably know this. When you eat a large meal, you can sort of feel the expansion in your abdominal cavity, and that's one of the main functions. Temporary storage place. And when you eat a large meal, the storage in the stomach sort of meters how food is going to be passed on into the small intestine. So it's stored there, and then little bits of it are passed on into the small intestine for digestion, further digestion. Okay, another main function of the stomach is mechanical digestion. And the stomach is a very muscular organ. So just going back to this slide, the muscularis layer in the stomach, unlike everywhere else in the alimentary canal, is composed of 3 sublayers. So there's a longitudinal layer. Fibers run this way along the length of the stomach. There's a circular layer. Fibers run around the circumference of the stomach. So that's just like everywhere else. But this layer, the oblique layer, in which the fibers run at an angle, is unique to the stomach. So because of these different layers with fibers running at different orientations, the stomach is able to contract in various ways. It's going to be able to mash the food that it contains within it. It even is able to jackknife at the lesser curvature. So that is pummeling the food inside, and that's the mechanical digestion that's happening in the stomach. There's also chemical digestion occurring in the stomach, and these are by virtue of enzymes that are secreted either in the stomach or before the stomach, for example, saliva. And the two main types of enzymes that are present are able to break down proteins by the proteases and lipids by the lipases. All right, let's take a look at the microscopic anatomy of the stomach. And if you think of the 4 layers that we talked about in previous videos, the feature of the stomach, which is highly modified, is the mucosal layer. The mucosal layer is modified, and we're going to talk about that next. And also the muscularis layer having 3 sublayers instead of 2. Let's focus in on the mucosal layer now. So if you look at just to remind you, the mucosal layer is the innermost layer, and that's in contact with material in the stomach. By the way, by the time food gets into the stomach, the bolus that's traveling through the esophagus is going to mix with the juices that are secreted by the stomach. And that mixture now is called chyme. It gets a different name because it's becoming more homogeneous and it's becoming more digested. So it's a much finer material at this point, not as granular, I guess you could say. So if we're looking at the mucosal layer of the stomach wall, one thing that's different from previous sections is the epithelial layer of the mucosal layer is made up of a simple columnar epithelium. And that is lining the entire inner surface of the stomach. Now, this is not a smooth layer of epithelium. There are places where there are pits that open into structures that penetrate deeper into the wall. So these are called the gastric pits. And these gastric pits lead to deeper mucosal epithelium penetrating into the layer below it. And these contain cells that secrete various products. So the collection of all those cells that secrete things are referred to as the gastric glands. So these are everywhere in the lining of the stomach. Openings, gastric pits, leading to secretory cells, the gastric glands. And they are illustrated somewhat in this slide, and this is meant to represent a section of the wall. This would be the lumen up here. Here's the simple columnar epithelium, part of the mucosal layer. And that's coating the entire surface, and then this epithelium dives down into a gastric pit. And here are all the secretory cells lying deeper within the lamina propria. This the loose connective tissue, areolar connective tissue layer here. Okay, so I want to focus in on these gastric pits and gastric glands down here on the next slide. So this is actually a histological section through the wall of the stomach. And this is the gastric pits, the openings here. They're leading into the gastric glands. These are all the secretory cells down here. So let's take a short video look at what's in the gastric glands. Okay, so let's talk about the stomach mucosal epithelium, the lining of the stomach. Stomach is a very harsh place, so the mucosal epithelium is doing a few different things. One is it's stomach wall. When food enters into the stomach, it's going to be digested. Good for food. We want that to happen. What we don't want is the same harsh contents to be digesting or breaking down the wall of the stomach. So there are a number of secretions, and the mucosal layer of the stomach wall has a number of modifications that allow these secretions to be made. So that's what we're looking at here, stomach mucosal epithelium. The epithelium is a simple columnar epithelium. So these are columnar cells, and these are going to dive down into the lamina propria here, okay? And this is just one example. The wall of the stomach has this throughout. All right, and I've listed 1, 2, 3, 4, and that should be number 5, different types of cells that you find that are secreting materials in the structure. First of all, what the structure is called, the wall is not just a continuous flat plane of cells. There are openings called gastric pits, and these gastric pits lead into an epithelial lined gland. That's the gastric gland here. Okay? Gastric pit is the opening. Gastric gland are the cells deep in the lamina propria that are secreting some substance. So what are these cells, first of all, and what are they secreting? So the cells that are on the surface and dive down a little bit into the pit, and that's on both sides here, these are the surface mucus cells. These cells secrete an alkaline mucus. The contents of the stomach, this would be the lumen up here, extremely acidic. That's good for digestion. However, we have to protect these cells from that harsh contents. So this alkaline mucus sits on the surface of these cells, and it's neutralizing the stomach acid that comes in contact with these cells, helping to protect them. You can think of it as a protective lining for these cells. Okay? That's one thing. Then as we go deeper into the pit here, now all of these from here down, these are the gastric gland. Okay, so there are different types of cells, and I've listed them 2, 3, 4, and should be 5. Okay, so what are these cells doing? The mucous neck cells are the neck, so deeper part of the neck of this structure. Those are the first cells you come to beyond the surface mucus cells. They're also making mucus, but this is an acidic mucus. This mucus is going to gather in this channel here. It's going to mix with other stuff that's being secreted, and then it's going to exit into the lumen of the stomach. That's one thing. As you go deeper along into the gastric gland, you encounter these parietal cells. The parietal cells are the cells that are responsible for making and secreting hydrochloric acid. That's where the acidity comes from. They also make a protein called intrinsic factor. So those two made from the parietal cells, and again, they're on both sides here. I'm only representing one, but there are a number of them mixed in. They're releasing these into the channel here. It's going to mix with the acidic mucus. Deeper in the gastric gland are what are called the chief cells. The chief cells are making 2 different types of digestive enzymes. One is called gastric lipase, the other is called pepsinogen. That's also going to mix in. All right? So the contents of what cells 2, 3, and 4, the mucous neck cells, the parietal cells, and the chief cells, they all mix together. 2, 3, and 4 here mixed together, and they secrete what's called gastric juice. Gastric juice is a mixture of all of those, and that's what's going to be secreted into the lumen of the stomach. All right? The 5th type of cell, deepest in the gastric gland, is secreting a hormone, gastrin. This hormone, like all hormones do, needs to get around in the body. And so it gets secreted the opposite way, not into the channel of the gland, but into the lamina propria layer, where there are blood vessels and hormones. As you know, the way hormones work, they get secreted and they go into a blood vessel and they get circulated in the body. Acidic mucus comes from the mucous neck cells, hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor coming from the parietal cells, pepsinogen and gastric lipase are coming from the chief cells. They all mix together, and that's going to enter into the stomach contents. Other secretion, gastrin, the hormone gastrin, this stimulates gastric motility, which means movement of chyme through the stomach onto the next segment of the intestinal tract, the small intestine. So those are the main secretion products, and I think I'll end this video here. All right, so that's a summary of the structure of the gastric glands and the gastric pits. Let's pose this question. Why do the gastric glands secrete such an acidic substance, the gastric juice? Why is it so acidic? Well, there are a couple of reasons. This is good for digestion. One of the reasons is it's required for activation of the enzymes that are secreted by the chief cells. So the pepsin, it's indicated on the slide here, but that's the active form of pepsinogen, which is initially secreted in the gastric juice. It only becomes active when it hits the very low, pH environment of the lumen of the stomach. And that's also true for gastric lipase. Another important feature of the acidity is it helps to denature proteins. So proteins that you eat in your food are in their native form, which is usually all balled up, some kind of spherical shape, let's say. And, proteins are a linear chain of amino acids. And it's going to take a lot longer to digest proteins if they're all in this kind of balled up spherical shape than if they were stretched out. So that's what happens when proteins hit the acidity of the stomach contents, is it causes them to denature, and they transform from a folded spherical shape into a more of a linear shape. That's more accessible to proteases to digest them, and that's going to speed up the rate of digestion. Another thing the acidity does is that it can break down the cell walls of any kind of ingested substances like plants, bacteria. So it's protective, and it also helps with digestion. This slide is just summarizing what it looks like in a gastric gland, and all of the secretions from the parietal cell, chief cell, mucous neck cell, those get dumped in together into the gastric gland lumen, and they're going to be secreted together as what's called gastric juice, a mixture of all of those substances. The G cells, on the other hand, those are the endocrine cells that secrete gastrin, the hormone. That secretion goes in the other direction. So that goes into a blood vessel that's running through the lamina propria. A little bit about motility in the stomach. So how does stuff move through the stomach? So there's a couple things that are going on: gastric mixing and gastric emptying. Gastric mixing is actually more about mechanical digestion than motility. And this is the contraction of the muscularis layer, which continuously churns the contents of the stomach. And it makes a much more homogeneous substance called the chyme. Gastric emptying is more about motility, and that's, if you eat a large meal, it's stored in the stomach, and small amounts of that, what's stored in the stomach, are allowed to progress through the pyloric sphincter. And that's because of the movement and the shape of the stomach peristaltic contractions push chyme toward the pylorus, and the pylorus is narrow, so that's kind of builds pressure at the pyloric sphincter, and that allows it to open in a small amount of the chyme to move on to the small intestine. And that's kind of illustrated in this slide. This is gastric mixing, kind of the constant churning of the muscularis, pummeling the food contents, mixing with the gastric juice, and that's the chyme that's present there. And in gastric emptying, it's the kind of the peristaltic wave that's pushing chyme into this narrowing channel that's forcing opening of the pyloric sphincter and allowing a small amount to move on. So emptying is a kind of a bit-by-bit process. All right, I think I'll stop this video here, and the next video will cover the small intestine.